The America Trap: Why Our Enemies Often Underestimate U.S. How quickly do times of apparent peace become times of conflict, seemingly stable world orders come crashing down, the hopes of many for improvement of the human condition are dashed and replaced by fear and despair. For the first dozen years after World War I, the three powerful democracies, the United States, Britain and France, were in substantial control of world affairs, economically, politically and militarily. They established the terms of the peace settlement, redrew the borders of Europe, summoned new nations into being, distributed pieces of defunct empires, erected security arrangements, determined who owed what to whom, and how and when debts should be paid. They called together the conferences that determined the levels of armaments the major nations could possess. All this was possible because they had won the war, because the United States and Britain controlled the banks and the seas, because France wielded predominant military power on the European continent. With this power, the three Western democracies sought to establish and consolidate a world system favorable to their interests and preferences. They argued over how best to do this, and they became increasingly estranged from each other in these years. But they all wanted a stable, prosperous and peaceful Europe. They all sought to preserve their global empires, or, in the United States case, its hemispheric hegemony. They all sought to defend the liberal, capitalist economic system that enriched and protected them and in which they believed. None doubted the rightness of their vision of international order or much questioned the justice of imposing it. And there had been successes, certainly from their point of view. By the second half of the 1920s, the world had grown less violent and marginally less miserable. In Europe especially, economies were recovering, living standards were rising, general violence was down from the immediate post-war years, and the dangers of war and aggression seemed as low as they had been in decades. Internationally, trade had risen by more than 20%, despite growing protectionism, driven largely by the American economic boom. Nations spent more time discussing measures for peace than preparing for war. The League of Nations had come into its own. Germany seemed to be on a moderate, democratic course. In general, the threat of a return to autocracy and militarism seemed low. Democracy seemed to be ascendant. Even those who openly defied the new order had to move cautiously. The Soviets promoted their revolution abroad but not so aggressively as to challenge the dominant powers, and they wound up settling for socialism in one country. Benito Mussolini, ruling an Italy surrounded in the Mediterranean by British and French naval power and dependent on the United States for financial support, thought it best to play the responsible European statesman. The 1920s were his decade of good behavior. Adolf Hitler, too, proceeded with caution as he ascended to power in the early 30s. Impressed by the United States as a giant state with unimaginable productive capacities and by Anglo-American domination of the global economy, and well aware of the role it had played in selecting Germany's past governments, he worked at first to soften Washington's opposition to his rise. He reached out to the U.S. ambassador, gave numerous interviews to prominent American media figures, including William Randolph Hearst, in the hope of making the personality of Adolf Hitler more accessible to the American people. He promised to pay Germany's private debts to American bankers and went out of his way to assure the English-speaking world that his National Socialist movement would gain power only in a purely legal way in accordance with the present Constitution. After taking power, he told the press and his own officials to play down the campaigns of anti-Semitism that began immediately. He sought to keep German rearmament under wraps in what he called the perilous interval during which the whole world was against us. Until the economy recovered and German rearmament was further along, he feared that the National Socialist Revolution could be crushed at any time by the superior power of the democracies. It was remarkable how quickly the winds were shifting, though. An American journalist identified the moment when history pivoted. In the first 5 years after the World War, he wrote, the nations of Europe, on their backs and seeking American aid, took all pains to avoid offending us and therefore appeared to give careful and weighty consideration to our altruistic advice. The succeeding 5 years have changed that. One indicator of the shifting trends was the declining fortunes of democracy throughout Europe. It was inevitable that some of the new democracies, implanted in lands that had never known such a form of government, would not survive. The rise of dictatorship in various forms in Hungary, 1920, Italy, 1925, Lithuania, Poland and Portugal, 1926, Yugoslavia, 1929, Romania, 1930, Germany and Austria, 1933, Bulgaria and Latvia, 1934, and Greece, 1935, had many internal and external causes, including the global depression that began around 1930. But the overall decline of European democracy from the second half of the 1920s onward, and the turn away from democracy in Japan, also reflected the declining influence and appeal of the great power democracies and their order. Liberal democracy was not just losing ground. It faced a potent challenge from a vibrant and revolutionary anti-liberal doctrine that attracted followers and imitators throughout Europe and beyond. Americans, British and French during World War I and for decades afterward assumed that Bolshevism posed the greatest threat to liberal democracy. But Bolshevism proved less easily exported than both its proponents and its opponents believed. Ostracized by the rest of Europe, the Soviet Union turned inward to wrestle with the transformation of its society. When democracies fell in the 1920s and 30s, they fell to the right, not the left. Mussolini's fascism had many roots. Some of the fascist worldview was unique to the Italian experience, but some of it transcended national boundaries. Above all, fascism represented a rejection of liberalism and the post-war Anglo-American political and economic order that had been imposed on the peoples of the have-not nations. Fascism promised to restore national and ethnic identity and culture even while modernizing the nation to compete in an industrializing world. It glorified the people not as individuals but as a collective, with the nation serving as the vehicle for their common destiny. Individual rights and legal processes had to be subordinated to the popular will, a will that could only be understood, articulated and executed by a single charismatic national leader, Illinois Duce, in whom the people could place their trust. By 1925, Mussolini introduced the idea of the totalitarian society, in which the state oversaw every aspect of life or, as he put it, everything within the state, nothing outside the state. Fascism was not an ideology of peace. To revise or overthrow this unjust order would require military power and the will to use it. Words are beautiful things, Mussolini said, but rifles, machine guns, ships, aircraft, and cannon are still more beautiful. Society had to be purged of flabby liberalism, quarreling political parties and alien elements, and forged into one unified collective fit for war. The people needed to be prepared for war by rigid control of politics, economics and society, and the elimination of all institutions that could stand in the way of the leader's total power, from the church to the aristocracy to the remnants of monarchy. Hitler's entire program was aimed at creating a new Germany that would not fail as Imperial Germany had in 1918. Democracy was the most disastrous thing there is, he told his top generals on the eve of taking power. Only one person can and should give orders. The German population had to learn to think nationalistically and thus be welded together, and this could only be accomplished by force. This fervent nationalism had transnational appeal. Whoever says that fascism is not an exportable commodity is mistaken, Mussolini declared. He hoped and expected that it would become to the 20th century what liberalism had been to the 19th. He even tried to promote fascism in the United States. He saw himself as the Pope of anti-democracy leading an anti-democratic crusade throughout the entire world. In the 1920s and 30s, fascist movements of varying hues and size cropped up in practically every nation in the world. It made less headway in Britain and the United States, where democracy was more firmly rooted, but it thrived in countries where liberal democratic institutions were new and fragile, including in France. Where fascism did not succeed, as in Romania and Hungary, it was usually because the government was already sufficiently right-wing and nationalist that fascists could not find an opening. Even in China, Chiang Kai-shek and his advisors marveled at how Mussolini had become the greatest and most picturesque statesman in Europe and thought that fascist Italy offered a model for how China could restore its national strength through the revitalization of a past great civilization. Mussolini always had international ambitions, even if in the 1920s he lacked the means of pursuing them. He was encouraged by the Japanese aggression in Manchuria and the weak and faltering response of the League of Nations and the United States. When Japan announced its withdrawal from the League of Nations in 1933, it was a sign that the other have-not nations might be willing and able to mount a rebellion against the Anglo-American system. But ultimately, it was to Germany that Mussolini looked for salvation. As far back as 1923, he had believed that the axis of European history passes through Berlin. He saw in Hitler's rise to power the historic opportunity for which he had been waiting. Hitler saw the fascist seizure of power in Italy as a harbinger of his own success and had such admiration for Mussolini that when they met for the first time in the summer of 1934, he had tears in his eyes. Mussolini believed a community of destiny united the fascist powers. The alliance between the two nations, his foreign minister declared, was based above all on the identity between their political regimes. By the mid-1930s, the Japanese had joined the anti-liberal club. As Yosuke Matsuoka, a leading Japanese fascist in the 1930s, argued, each of the have-not nations was fighting for recognition and its place in the eyes of the world. The entry of Japan into what Hitler would call the triangle of challengers to the Anglo-American system was the final step in a geopolitical revolution. As one Japanese author noted in 1934, the world now contained two tinderboxes, one in the Western Pacific and one in Europe, and the two were interlocked. A crisis in one can easily extend to the other and assume a global character. Hitler believed that if the British were confronted not only by Germany and Italy in Europe but also by a common organized force in the Far East, they would have no choice but to accept Germany's rise and even seek common ground with this new political system. President Franklin D. Roosevelt was an internationalist, but he spent his first term in office fighting the Great Depression and his second term trying to cajole Americans out of their rigid anti-interventionism. After the fall of France in 1940, he shifted into a more alarmist mode. The conquest of France gave the Germans new bases on the Atlantic coast from which to operate against British shipping and their naval convoys. This greatly extended the reach of the German U-boat fleet, which had grown more sophisticated in its tactics. The Germans by early 1941 were sinking British merchant ships at a rate more than 5 times Britain's capacity to replace them. Roosevelt's alarmed advisors argued for direct American military involvement to protect Britain's transatlantic lifeline. Roosevelt, who feared that the public was not yet ready, was reluctant to take such a big step forward, to which Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson replied, "Well, I hope you will keep on walking, Mr. President." Keep on walking. Roosevelt did. He began allowing British ships to be repaired in American ports. He transferred Coast Guard cutters to the Royal Navy. He gained the Danish government's permission to place Greenland under American control and authorized the establishment of bases there to help defend transatlantic shipping. In April, he authorized the Navy to begin working with the British on plans for escorting convoys. And although he continued to shy away from announcing such a policy openly, an April poll suggested the public was still opposed, 50 to 41%. He ordered U.S. naval patrols to help the British spot German subs. A string of Nazi victories in the spring of 1941 made the situation more dire. German forces invaded and occupied Greece. Yugoslavia fell in 11 days. With General Erwin Rommel leading his Afrika Korps, the Germans were punishing British and Australian forces in North Africa. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill begged Roosevelt to step up American assistance and even to enter the war officially. Unless the United States took more advanced positions now, or very soon, Churchill warned, vast balances may be tilted heavily to our disadvantage. The America Trap: Why Our Enemies Often Underestimate U.S. How quickly do times of apparent peace become times of conflict, seemingly stable world orders come crashing down, the hopes of many for improvement of the human condition are dashed and replaced by fear and despair. For the first dozen years after World War I, the three powerful democracies, the United States, Britain and France, were in substantial control